Captain Victoria Romano pressed her face against the small window of Western Sky Airlines Flight 447, watching the snow-capped peaks of the Rocky Mountains drift beneath her like a postcard come to life. For the first time in 18 months, she was just a passenger. No pre-flight checks, no weather briefings, no responsibility for 180 souls aboard a commercial aircraft. Just enjoying the view at 35,000 feet. Then the port engine exploded in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The aircraft lurched violently to the left, and First Officer Kyle Brennan turned to her with panic in his eyes and asked the question that would change everything. "Ma'am, I know this sounds crazy, but can you fly this thing?" The woman they'd dismissed as too emotional for command decisions was about to prove that sometimes the most qualified pilot on an aircraft is the one nobody expects to save their lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But to understand how Victoria Romano went from passenger to hero in the span of 3 terrifying minutes, we need to go back to where it all began. Back to Whitman Air Force Base in Nevada, where 18 months earlier she'd walked out of Colonel Frank Russo's office with her dreams of commanding military transport aircraft crushed by a single devastating conversation that would echo in her mind for over a year. Victoria had built her entire career on precision and preparation. 23 years old, top of her class at the Air Force Academy, with flight training scores that consistently placed her in the 95th percentile. She'd mastered every aircraft she'd been allowed to touch, from basic trainers to complex multi-engine transports. Her simulator hours exceeded requirements by 60%. Her technical knowledge was encyclopedic, and her decision-making under pressure had earned commendations from instructors who rarely handed out praise. The C-130 Hercules program represented everything she'd worked toward since childhood. 4-engine military transport aircraft capable of landing on unprepared airstrips, delivering critical supplies to combat zones, and evacuating personnel from hostile environments. It was flying that mattered, aviation with purpose, missions, where excellence meant the difference between soldiers coming home alive or not coming home at all. Standing in Colonel Russo's office that Tuesday morning in March, surrounded by photographs of transport missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and humanitarian operations around the globe, Victoria felt confident that her qualifications would speak for themselves. Her file was immaculate, no disciplinary actions, no failed evaluations, no questions about her technical competence or professional dedication. "Romano," Colonel Russo had said without looking up from the paperwork spread across his desk, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority that ended conversations before they could begin. "You're not what we're looking for in the C-130 program." The words hit like a physical blow. Victoria had prepared for questions about her experience, had rehearsed answers about her training methodology, had compiled documentation of every achievement that qualified her for transport command. She hadn't prepared for outright rejection, without explanation or discussion. "Sir, with respect, my qualification scores exceed program requirements across all categories. My flight hours, technical evaluations, and leadership assessments all place me in the top 5% of candidates." Russo's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind that suggested her achievements were irrelevant to considerations she couldn't possibly understand. "Romano, flying transport aircraft isn't about test scores or simulator performance. It's about making life and death decisions in combat zones with hundreds of soldiers depending on your judgment. That requires a different kind of mental toughness than what you've demonstrated." The accusation stung because it was so fundamentally wrong. Everything Victoria had done since arriving at Whitman had been focused on developing exactly that kind of judgment. She'd studied every emergency protocol, memorized every system specification, trained extensively in high-pressure scenarios specifically because she understood the responsibility that came with transport command. Sir, I've excelled in every pressure situation I've been placed in. My decision-making evaluations consistently rate as exceptional, and my technical knowledge of C-130 systems is comprehensive. Technical knowledge isn't the same as combat readiness, Russo interrupted. The selection committee has made its decision. You'll be reassigned to base operations, important work managing flight schedules and logistics. But the C-130 program requires pilots with proven capability under extreme stress. Through the window behind Russo's desk, Victoria could see the C-130 she'd dreamed of commanding. A massive 4-engine beast sitting on the tarmac, its cargo ramp lowered. Ground crews loading equipment for a training mission that should have been hers to fly. Captain Mark Donovan was already conducting his pre-flight walk-around, preparing for the advanced tactical training that represented everything Victoria had spent years working toward. I understand the C-130 represents significant responsibility. Sir, that's exactly why I've prepared so thoroughly for this opportunity. What I don't understand is how I'm supposed to prove my capability under extreme stress if I'm never given the chance to demonstrate it. Russo's expression hardened, his gray eyes showing no recognition of her achievements or acknowledgement of the contradiction in his reasoning. That kind of thinking is exactly what concerns me, Romano. This isn't about proving yourself or seeking validation. This is about proven performance when American lives are on the line. The C-130 program is for pilots who've already demonstrated they can handle pressure, not pilots who think they deserve the chance to find out. The conversation felt surreal. Victoria was being dismissed for lacking experience that could only be gained through opportunities she was being denied. Her preparation and qualifications were being treated as evidence of inexperience rather than readiness, while less qualified candidates received positions based on assumptions about their potential rather than demonstrate capabilities. Sir, I respectfully request consideration for request denied. Russo's voice cut through her words like a blade, final and absolute. The decision is made, Romano. Report to Major Helen Cross in base operations at 0800 tomorrow. Should brief you on your new responsibilities. As Victoria saluted and prepared to leave, Russo added a comment that would haunt her for months to come. Romano, some doors aren't meant for everyone. The sooner you accept that your strengths lie in support operations rather than command positions, the better your career will be. Outside the office, the Nevada sun felt harsh against her face. The flight line buzzed with activity ground crews, prepping aircraft, pilots conducting briefings, the controlled chaos of military aviation at its finest. But Victoria felt like she was watching it all through bulletproof glass, separated from the world she'd trained so hard to join by decisions that seemed to have nothing to do with her actual capabilities. Master, Sergeant Rachel Kim approached. From the maintenance hangar, her expression sympathetic. Kim had been watching the C-130 program for 8 years, had seen talented pilots come and go, had witnessed the politics and prejudices that sometimes influence decisions that should have been based purely on merit. Rough meeting? Kim asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. They've decided I'm not suited for command positions, Victoria replied quietly, watching Donovan climb into the C-130's cockpit. Maybe they're right. Maybe I've been fooling myself about what I'm capable of. Or maybe they're not ready to see capability in places where they haven't learned to look for it, Kim said. Sometimes the system has to be shocked into recognizing what it's been missing. As Donovan's C-130 lifted off, its distinctive engine signature cutting through the desert air, Victoria felt something crystallize inside her. Russo was wrong about one thing. This wasn't about personal validation or seeking recognition. It was about proving that excellence couldn't be measured by traditional assumptions alone. That potential often existed in forms that conventional wisdom didn't know how to evaluate. She didn't know it yet, but circumstances were already conspiring to create exactly the kind of shock Kim had mentioned. In 18 months, Victoria would find herself aboard a civilian aircraft, where her dismissed qualifications would become the only thing standing between 180 passengers and catastrophic disaster. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of jet engines. But somewhere in the back of her mind, Victoria began to understand that rejection wasn't always the end of a story sometimes. It was just the beginning of a different chapter altogether. The mess hall at Whitman Air Force Base buzzed with the usual evening conversation, deployment stories, upcoming training exercises, complaints about the Nevada heat. But that night, Victoria noticed something different in the way conversations stopped when she approached. How groups of pilots suddenly found reasons to disperse when she sat down with her tray of barely edible military cuisine. "Don't let it get to you," said Lieutenant Alex Reeves, settling into the seat across from her. Reeves was one of the few pilots who'd consistently treated her as an equal rather than an intruder in a boys' club. "The rumor mill works overtime around here, especially when someone challenges the status quo." "What rumors?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "That you went over Russo's head. That you're planning to file discrimination complaints. That you ACCUSED, the selection committee of gender bias." Reeves shook his head. "You know how it is. One person makes an assumption, passes it along as fact, and suddenly it becomes accepted truth throughout the entire base." Victoria pushed her food around her plate, appetite gone. "I haven't filed any complaints. I haven't talked to anyone outside the chain of command. I haven't done anything except accept the decision and report to my new assignment tomorrow morning. I know that. Kim knows that. Hell, half the base knows that. But Russo's been making the rounds, talking to other commanders, making sure everyone understands why you weren't selected for the C-130 program." Reeves lowered his voice. "According to him, you lack the emotional stability for command decisions. Too focused on personal achievement rather than mission success. Says female pilots are fine for support roles, but combat operations require a different kind of mindset." The accusations hit like salt in an open wound. Everything Victoria had done since arriving at Whitman had been focused on becoming the most competent pilot possible for whatever mission she might be asked to fly. She'd studied tactics, memorized emergency procedures, trained harder than anyone else in her peer group, specifically because she understood the weight of responsibility that came with military aviation. "There's something else," Reeves continued, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "Donovan's been bragging about how Russo specifically chose him over you. Says Russo told him that women are too risk-averse to make the split-second decisions that save lives in combat zones. Claims female pilots overthink situations where male pilots trust their instincts." The words felt like a personal attack on everything Victoria had worked to become. She'd spent years proving she could handle high-pressure situations, had excelled in every scenario designed to test decision-making under stress. The suggestion that her gender made her inherently unsuitable for command positions was both insulting and demonstrably false, based on her actual performance record. "Alex, can I ask you something?" Victoria kept her voice low, conscious of the conversations around them. "In all your training with me, in all the exercises we've run together, have you ever seen me hesitate when quick decisions needed to be made? Never. You're one of the most decisive pilots I've worked with. Your tactical thinking is sharper than most of the guys who've been flying for years." Reeves paused, then added, "Which is probably why some of them are so eager to see you reassigned to a desk job." That evening, Victoria walked the perimeter of the base, needing space to think away from the suffocating atmosphere of speculation and judgment. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of purple and gold by the setting sun. In the distance, she could hear the sounds of night training exercises, jet engines, helicopter rotors, the controlled violence of military preparation for missions that might never come. she thought about her father, Chief Master Sergeant Anthony Romano, who'd spent 28 years maintaining the aircraft that carried soldiers into and out of harm's way around the world. He'd taught her that the military was supposed to be a meritocracy where performance mattered more than politics or personal connections. But he'd also warned her that changing institutional cultures took time, that she'd face resistance from people who confused tradition with effectiveness. The key, he'd told her during one of their last conversations before his retirement, is to be so undeniably excellent at what you do that they can't ignore your capabilities. Not good enough to meet standards, not good enough to get by, but so exceptional that denying your qualifications becomes impossible. But what happened when exceptional performance wasn't enough? What happened when the gatekeepers decided that certain doors would remain closed regardless of achievements or capabilities? What happened when the system itself was designed to protect mediocrity over merit? Her phone buzzed with a text message from Kim. Heard about the rumors. Don't let the politics get in your head. Your skills are real, and eventually, the right opportunity will prove it. Sometimes the universe creates moments when all the prejudice in the world can't override performance. Victoria smiled despite herself. Kim had survived 15 years in a military that was still adjusting to women in combat roles. She'd faced every form of institutional resistance imaginable, had fought battles that cleared the path for pilots like Victoria to even have opportunities to apply for programs like 100 to 130 training. But Kim's message carried an undertone that Victoria was beginning to understand. The right opportunity might not come through official channels or traditional advancement paths. Sometimes circumstances arose where normal rules didn't apply, where performance became the only thing that mattered, where capability trumped politics simply because lives were on the line. Back in her quarters, Victoria spread out the C-130 technical manuals she'd been studying for months. If Russo was right about one thing, it was that transport aircraft represented incredible responsibility. Every system, every capability, every emergency procedure had been designed to accomplish missions that other aircraft couldn't handle. To bring soldiers home safely from situations where failure meant death. She began reviewing the emergency procedures she'd memorized: engine failures, hydraulic malfunctions, emergency landings on damaged runways. The manual covered dozens of situations that could arise during transport operations, each requiring specific responses and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. As she studied, Victoria found herself wondering about the humanitarian missions scheduled for the next month. Intelligence reports suggested deteriorating conditions in several overseas locations where American personnel might need emergency evacuation. If something went wrong during those operations, if circumstances arose that required immediate transport capability, who would respond? The question lingered in her mind as she prepared for bed, unaware that 18 months later, she'd find herself in exactly the kind of emergency situation where theoretical knowledge would become life-or-death reality. Outside her window, the Nevada night was filled with the sounds of a military base that never truly slept: security patrols, maintenance crews, the distant rumble of aircraft engines being tested. Somewhere in that darkness, circumstances were already beginning to align in ways that would challenge every assumption about who was qualified for command decisions and who deserved the chance to prove themselves when American lives hung in the balance. 18 months later, Victoria found herself in a place she'd never imagined during her military career, seated in the passenger cabin of a commercial airliner, wearing civilian clothes with no responsibility for the aircraft's operation beyond fastening her seatbelt and following crew instructions. The transition from military pilot to civilian passenger had been more jarring than she'd anticipated. After her reassignment to base operations at Whitman, Victoria had spent 14 months managing flight schedules, coordinating logistics, and watching other pilots fly the missions she'd trained for. The work was important, she understood that, but every time she saw a C-130 taxi past her office window, the sting of rejection felt fresh and sharp. She was managing the very operation she'd dreamed of executing, reduced to a spectator in the profession she'd dedicated her life to mastering. The final straw had come during a conversation with Major Helen Cross, her commanding officer in base operations. Cross was professional but distant, making it clear that while she respected Victoria's qualifications, dwelling on what might have been wouldn't serve anyone's interests. "You're an exceptional administrator, Romano," Cross had said during Victoria's annual evaluation. "Your efficiency in coordinating complex flight operations has improved our overall mission effectiveness by 15%. That's the kind of contribution that builds successful military careers." The words were meant to be encouraging, but they felt hollow. Victoria had trained for flight operations, had prepared for the challenges that came with command decisions and tactical missions. Managing other people's flights was crucial work, but it wasn't the work she'd spent years preparing to excel at. The breaking point had come when she'd been assigned to coordinate a humanitarian mission, to evacuate American civilians from a natural disaster zone. She'd planned every detail: fuel calculations, weather routing, passenger manifests, emergency procedures, while other pilots executed the mission she'd designed. Watching the C-130s depart for operations she'd orchestrated but couldn't participate in had crystallized her growing understanding that the military wasn't going to provide the opportunity she'd earned through her qualifications. Lieutenant Colonel James Parker, the base psychiatrist, had been surprisingly direct during their mandatory counseling session. "Romano, you're one of the most technically competent pilots I've ever evaluated, but this assignment is destroying your professional satisfaction. Have you considered that your skills might be better utilized in civilian aviation?" The suggestion had initially felt like defeat. Abandoning her military career meant accepting that institutional prejudice had successfully forced her out of the profession she'd chosen. But Parker had helped her reframe the decision as strategic rather than surrender. "The commercial aviation industry is facing a massive pilot shortage," he'd explained. "Airlines are actively recruiting military pilots with exactly your qualifications. You could be flying passenger aircraft, cargo operations, even emergency medical services. The skills you've developed don't disappear just because you change uniforms." The transition process had taken 4 months. Victoria completed her commercial pilot certifications, accumulated the flight hours required for airline employment, and navigated the complex process of translating military experience into civilian qualifications. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same skills that the military had deemed unsuitable for command positions made her an attractive candidate for commercial aviation. Western Sky Airlines had hired her immediately after her interview. Captain Jennifer Walsh, the chief pilot who conducted her evaluation, had been impressed by Victoria's technical knowledge and systematic approach to flight operations. "We need pilots who understand that flying passengers isn't just about getting from point A to point B," Walsh had explained. "It's about managing complex systems under pressure, making decisions that affect hundreds of lives, and maintaining safety standards that never compromise. Your military background suggests you understand that level of responsibility." The job offer had included immediate assignment to wide-body aircraft operations, exactly the kind of command responsibility the military had denied her. But Victoria had requested a 6-month delay before beginning active flying, wanting time to decompress from the stress and disappointment of her military experience. That's how she found herself in seat 12A aboard Western Sky Flight 447, traveling from Phoenix to Portland for a job interview with a charter company that specialized in emergency medical flights. The position would involve flying critical patients to specialized treatment facilities, operations that required exactly the kind of quick decision-making and pressure management she'd been told she lacked. As the Boeing 737 climbed through 20,000 feet, Victoria watched the landscape transform from desert browns to mountain whites, marveling at the perspective that came with being a passenger rather than a pilot. For the first time in years, she could simply enjoy the view without calculating fuel consumption, monitoring weather patterns, or coordinating with air traffic control. The flight crew seemed competent enough. Captain Mark Donovan, the same pilot who had taken her place in the C-130 program, was apparently now flying commercial aircraft after completing his military service. The coincidence felt like cosmic irony, but Victoria had moved beyond anger to something approaching indifference about the choices that had led them to this moment. First Officer Kyle Brennan, Donovan's co-pilot, had introduced himself to passengers. During boarding with the nervous energy of someone relatively new to commercial aviation, his youth and enthusiasm reminded Victoria of herself during her early training days, when every flight represented an opportunity to prove her capabilities rather than a reminder of opportunities denied. As Flight 447 leveled off at cruising altitude, Victoria allowed herself to relax in a way that hadn't been possible during her military service. No pre-flight briefings, no mission planning, no responsibility for aircraft systems or passenger safety. Just a window seat, a magazine she wasn't reading, and the luxury of being transported rather than doing the transporting. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly below, their snow-covered peaks catching the afternoon sunlight like scattered diamonds. From 35,000 feet, the landscape looked peaceful and manageable, a perspective that made human conflicts seem insignificant against the vast indifference of geography. Victoria's phone contained several text messages from her interview. Contact in Portland, confirming meeting times and expressing enthusiasm about her qualifications. The medical charter company had specifically requested her application based on recommendations from military colleagues who understood her capabilities regardless of how they'd been officially evaluated. She thought about Kim's prediction that the universe would create moments when performance mattered more than politics. Maybe this civilian opportunity represented exactly that kind of moment, a chance to prove her capabilities in an environment where results spoke louder than institutional prejudices. The flight attendant, a professional woman named Rachel Kim, checked on passengers with the kind of systematic attention to detail that Victoria recognized from her own approach to responsibility. Good crews created environments where problems were anticipated and addressed before they became emergencies, whether in military or commercial aviation. As Victoria settled back to enjoy the remaining 2 hours of flight time, she had no idea that her relaxing trip to Portland was about to become the most challenging flight operation of her career. Sometimes the universe's timing was more precise than anyone could anticipate, and occasionally, the moments when performance mattered most arrived without warning aboard aircraft where the most qualified pilot happened to be sitting in a passenger seat, supposedly just enjoying the view. The Boeing 737-800 cut through the thin air at flight level 350 with the steady reliability that made commercial aviation feel routine to most passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Donovan was reviewing their route to Portland, while First Officer Kyle Brennan monitored the aircraft systems with the methodical attention required for safe flight operations. Donovan had transitioned to commercial aviation 8 months earlier, after completing his military service flying C-130 transport aircraft. His resume looked impressive on paper. Decorated military pilot, combat experience, thousands of flight hours in complex aircraft. What it didn't show was that his military success had come at the expense of more qualified candidates who'd been dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities. "Weather ahead looks good," Brennan reported, scanning the displays that showed clear skies between their current position and Portland International Airport. "No significant turbulence forecast. Winds favorable for runway 28 left approach." Brennan was 26 years old, enthusiastic about commercial aviation, but with limited experience in emergency situations. His training had been thorough, But like most co-pilots fresh from flight school, his understanding of crisis management remained largely theoretical. The kind of split-second decision-making that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones hadn't been tested under real-world pressure. In the passenger cabin, flight attendant Rachel Kim was conducting her routine safety checks with professional efficiency. The cabin was about 60% full, 108 passengers traveling for business, vacation, and personal reasons that had brought them aboard Flight 447 for what everyone expected to be an unremarkable trip to the Pacific Northwest of Victoria. Had dozed off somewhere over Utah, her head resting against the window, finally experiencing the kind of relaxation that had been impossible during her military service. The stress of constantly proving herself, of navigating institutional politics that seemed designed to frustrate merit-based advancement, had been more exhausting than she'd realized until it was gone. But professional instincts developed over years of aviation training don't disappear just because someone changes careers. Even in sleep, Victoria's mind remained tuned to the subtle sounds and sensations that indicated normal flight operations. The steady hum of the engines, the slight vibrations transmitted through the aircraft structure, the pressure changes that accompanied altitude adjustments, all registered subconsciously as indicators that everything was proceeding as expected. In the cockpit, Donovan was reviewing his approach charts for Portland when the first anomaly appeared on his engine display. A slight fluctuation in the port engine's exhaust gas temperature, barely noticeable, well within normal operating parameters, but different enough to catch his attention. "Kyle, take a look at engine 1EGT, Donovan said, pointing to the digital readout that monitored the port engine's internal temperature. Seeing some variation there. Brennan studied the display, comparing the current readings to his understanding of normal engine behavior. The fluctuations were minor, the kind of variation that experienced pilots learned to distinguish between insignificant anomalies and early warning signs of developing problems. "Looks like normal variation to me," Brennan replied, though his tone suggested less confidence than his words conveyed. "All parameters are within green range. Oil pressure and temperature normal, fuel flow consistent." Donovan nodded, but continued monitoring the engine displays with increased attention. Years of flying transport aircraft had taught him that mechanical problems rarely announced themselves dramatically. They usually began as small irregularities that gradually developed into serious issues. The key to preventing emergencies was recognizing patterns before they became critical. What neither pilot realized was that Flight 447's port engine was experiencing early stages of turbine blade failure, a catastrophic mechanical problem that would progress from minor temperature fluctuations to complete engine destruction within the next 12 minutes. The titanium alloy blades that compressed air for combustion were developing microscopic cracks that would soon propagate into catastrophic structural failure. The engine manufacturer had issued service bulletins about this specific problem, recommending inspections after certain flight hour thresholds. But Western Sky Airlines was facing financial pressure that had led to maintenance deferrals and inspection delays that prioritized operational schedules over safety margins. The same economic pressures that had influenced Simpson's maintenance falsifications were affecting commercial aviation with potentially identical consequences. Professor Janet Fields, seated 3 rows behind Victoria, was reviewing research papers for an academic conference in Portland. As a mechanical engineering professor specializing in metallurgy, she would have immediately recognized the significance of the engine temperature fluctuations if she'd been monitoring the cockpit displays. Her published research on metal fatigue and high temperature applications had specifically addressed the failure modes that were developing in Flight 447's port engine. Dr. Emily Watson, a trauma surgeon seated near the front of the cabin, was using the flight time to review medical journals, unaware that her emergency medical skills might soon be needed at 35,000 feet if the developing mechanical problem progressed to catastrophic failure. The irony was profound. Aircraft carried passengers with exactly the expertise needed to understand and respond to the crisis that was developing. But commercial aviation's rigid separation between flight crew and passenger cabin meant that knowledge remained isolated and unused. In the cockpit, Donovan's growing concern about the engine readings was creating tension between his instincts and his schedule pressure. Landing in Portland for unscheduled maintenance would delay passengers, create logistical complications, and generate questions from airline management about his decision-making. The economic pressures that influenced military maintenance decisions were equally present in commercial aviation. "Should we contact maintenance control?" Brennan asked, recognizing Donovan's increased attention to the engine displays, but unsure whether the situation warranted diverting their flight. "Let's monitor it for a few more minutes," Donovan replied, a decision that demonstrated the same flawed risk assessment that had characterized his military career. "If it stabilizes, we'll continue to Portland and write it up for ground maintenance. If it gets worse, we'll consider our options." The decision to continue monitoring rather than immediately addressing a developing problem would prove catastrophic within minutes. But it reflected the institutional pressures and personal decision-making patterns that had allowed less qualified pilots to advance, while more capable candidates were dismissed for imaginary shortcomings. Victoria stirred slightly in her sleep, some subconscious awareness registering that the engine sounds had changed subtly. Years of aviation training had developed her ability to detect anomalies that most passengers would never notice, but fatigue and the relaxation of finally being a passenger, rather than a pilot, kept her from full awareness. Outside the aircraft, the Rocky Mountains continued their ancient vigil, indifferent to the human drama developing at 35,000 feet above their peaks. In 8 minutes, Flight 447 would transition from routine commercial operation to life-threatening emergency, and the most qualified pilot aboard would be awakened by an explosion that would test everything she'd learned about flying under pressure. The universe was about to create exactly the kind of moment where performance mattered more than politics, where capability trumped institutional prejudice, and where the pilot everyone had dismissed as unready for command decisions would face the ultimate test of everything she'd been told she lacked. At 14:23 Mountain Time, 47 minutes into what had been a routine flight to Portland, the port engine of Western Sky Flight 447 destroyed itself in a catastrophic failure that would be heard and felt by every soul aboard the aircraft. Victoria jolted awake as the Boeing 737 lurched violently to the left, her body pressed against the window by centrifugal forces that shouldn't exist during normal flight operations. The sound was unmistakable to anyone with aviation experience, the distinctive roar and metallic shriek of turbine blades disintegrating at thousands of rotations per minute, followed by the sudden silence that meant complete engine failure. Through her window, Victoria saw what every pilot feared most: the port engine consumed by orange flames and black smoke, pieces of metal spinning away from the aircraft like deadly shrapnel. The engine cowling had partially separated, exposing the destruction within, while hydraulic fluid and fuel created a trail of vapor that marked their path through the sky. In the cockpit, chaos erupted as multiple warning systems activated simultaneously. Master caution lights illuminated the instrument panel like a Christmas tree. Warning chimes competed for attention, and the aircraft's flight management computer began announcing system failures in its mechanically calm voice that contrasted sharply with the emergency unfolding around them. "Engine failure, port engine," Brennan shouted, his voice cracking with stress as he struggled to process the cascade of information flooding their displays. "Fire warning, hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical system anomalies." Donovan fought the flight controls as the aircraft yawed sharply toward the failed engine, the asymmetric thrust from the remaining starboard engine trying to push them into an uncontrollable spin. Years of training had taught him the immediate responses required for engine failure, But the reality of managing a real emergency at altitude proved far more challenging than simulator exercises. "Shut down Engine 1," Donovan commanded, his own voice showing the strain of managing multiple simultaneous problems. "Fire suppression, emergency checklist." But even as Brennan reached for the engine shutdown controls, both pilots realized this wasn't a simple engine failure. The violence of the destruction, the continued vibrations shaking the aircraft, and the multiple system warnings suggested damage that extended far beyond the failed engine itself. In the passenger cabin, the explosion had created immediate panic. Children were crying, adults were praying or cursing, and flight attendant Rachel Kim was moving through the aisles with professional calm, checking on passengers while managing her own fear about what the engine failure meant for their survival. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened," Kim announced over the cabin address system, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "We are experiencing a mechanical problem, and the flight crew is following established procedures to ensure your safety." Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, ignoring the turbulence that made walking difficult, her mind automatically shifting into emergency response mode. Years of training had conditioned her to react to aviation crises with systematic analysis rather than panic, and what she observed suggested problems far more serious than a simple engine failure. The aircraft was vibrating in a pattern that indicated structural damage, not just power plant failure. The way Donovan was fighting the controls suggested hydraulic problems that would complicate every aspect of flying the aircraft. Most concerning, the continued trail of vapor behind the port wing indicated fuel or hydraulic leaks that could lead to fire or complete loss of flight control systems. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Kim said as Victoria moved toward the front of the cabin. "For your safety, all passengers need to remain seated during this emergency." "I'm a pilot," Victoria replied quietly, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of aviation experience. "Commercial and military rated. If the crew needs assistance, I'm available." Kim hesitated, recognizing that airline procedures discouraged passenger interference with flight operations, but also understanding that exceptional circumstances might require flexibility in applying normal rules. The gravity of their situation was becoming increasingly apparent, and additional expertise might prove crucial for survival. Through the cockpit door, Victoria could hear the stressed voices of Donovan and Brennan as they worked through emergency checklists while struggling to maintain aircraft control. Their communication pattern suggested they were overwhelmed by the complexity of the problems they were facing, exactly the kind of situation where additional experience could make the difference between successful emergency management and catastrophic failure. Professor Fields approached Victoria from her seat 3 rows back, her face showing the concern of someone who understood the engineering implications of what they'd witnessed. "The engine destruction looked like turbine blade failure," she said quietly. "If debris damaged other systems, this could be much worse than a simple power plant problem." Dr. Watson had moved to assist an elderly passenger who was experiencing chest pains triggered by the stress of the emergency. But her medical training also included understanding of aviation physiology and the effects of rapid decompression or emergency descent procedures. The aircraft shuddered again, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the damaged port wing, and Victoria felt her professional instincts override any consideration of passenger protocols. These people needed help, and she had the training to provide it, regardless of whether airline procedures authorized passenger pilots to assist with flight operations. Kim made a decision that would prove crucial for everyone. Aboard Flight 447. "Come with me," she told Victoria, moving toward the cockpit. "If you're really qualified to help, they need to know you're available." As they approached the cockpit door, Victoria could hear Donovan's voice rising with frustration as he struggled with flight controls that weren't responding normally to his inputs. "Kyle, I can't maintain altitude." We're losing hydraulic pressure on multiple systems. Get me options for emergency landing airports." Brennan's response was barely audible over the warning chimes, but his tone suggested he was equally overwhelmed by the emergency procedures they were attempting to manage simultaneously. "Denver is closest, but we're losing altitude faster than normal descent rate. I'm not sure we can maintain control long enough to reach any major airport." Kim knocked on the cockpit door and used her crew key to unlock it, revealing a scene of controlled chaos as both pilots worked frantically to manage systems that were failing faster than they could address them. The instrument panel looked like a medical patient in crisis, with red warning lights indicating multiple system failures that compounded each other in ways that exceeded their training scenarios. "Captain," Kim said, her voice cutting through the noise of alarms and stressed communication, "I have a passenger who's a qualified pilot, both commercial and military rated. She's offering assistance if you need it." Donovan glanced back, his face showing the strain of managing an emergency that was pushing him beyond his comfort zone and training level. In that moment, Victoria saw recognition flash across his features as he realized who was standing behind his flight attendant. "Romano?" Donovan's voice carried disbelief mixed with desperation. "What are you doing here?" "Flying to Portland for a job interview," Victoria replied calmly, her voice a stark contrast to the stress evident in the cockpit. "But right now, I'm available to help if you need another qualified pilot." The irony of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. The pilot, who had been dismissed as unqualified for command decisions, was now being asked to help save an aircraft that the supposedly more qualified pilot couldn't control alone. Sometimes the universe created situations where prejudice became irrelevant and only capability mattered for survival. The cockpit of Flight 447 felt like a war zone. Warning lights bathed everything in red, alarm chimes competed for attention, and the aircraft shuddered with vibrations that suggested structural damage, extending far beyond the destroyed engine. Donovan's hands gripped the yoke with white-knuckled intensity as he fought to maintain control of an aircraft that seemed determined to kill everyone aboard. "We've lost primary hydraulics," Brennan reported, his voice cracking under stress as he worked through emergency checklists that seemed inadequate for the cascade of failures they were experiencing. "Backup system is showing pressure loss. Flight controls are getting mushy." Victoria stepped into the cockpit and immediately assessed the situation with the systematic approach that had made her exceptional during military training. The engine failure had been catastrophic enough to damage multiple systems, creating exactly the kind of complex emergency that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "What's your fuel situation?" she asked, her voice calm in contrast to the chaos around them. "About 4 hours remaining," Donovan replied, sweat beading on his forehead as he struggled with increasingly unresponsive controls. "But I don't think we can maintain controlled flight that long. The hydraulic failures are making it nearly impossible to manage altitude and heading." Victoria studied the instrument displays, her mind processing information with the speed that came from years of emergency training. The hydraulic pressure readings confirmed her worst fears. They were facing the aviation equivalent of losing brakes and steering simultaneously while traveling at highway speeds. "Denver Center, Western Sky 447 declaring emergency." Brennan transmitted to air traffic control, his voice showing the strain of managing radio communications while monitoring failing systems. "We have experienced catastrophic engine failure with multiple system damage. Requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport and emergency equipment standing by." The response from Denver Center was immediate and professional. "Western Sky 447. Emergency declared. Squawk 7700. Nearest airport is Denver International. Bearing 095 degrees 47 miles. Current weather ceiling 2,500 feet. Visibility 10 miles. Winds 270 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment will be standing by." 47 miles might as well have been 400 given their deteriorating flight controls. Victoria could see in Donovan's face the growing realization that his training hadn't prepared him for this level of system failure, that the textbook procedures he was attempting to follow assumed aircraft systems that were no longer functioning. Normally, the backup hydraulic system is failing faster than normal, Victoria observed, studying the pressure readings. You've probably got debris damage to multiple lines. In about 10 minutes, you're going to lose most flight control authority. Donovan's response revealed the depth of his crisis. I don't know what to do. The emergency procedures assume we maintain basic control authority, but these controls are becoming unresponsive. We're losing altitude at 800 feet per minute, and I can't arrest the descent. It was Brennan who asked the question that changed everything. Ma'am, I know this sounds crazy, but can you fly this thing? Because Captain Donovan is fighting controls that aren't responding, and I'm running out of emergency procedures that apply to our situation. The cockpit fell silent except for the warning chimes and the sound of air rushing past the damaged aircraft. Victoria looked at the two pilots who were supposed to be responsible for 108 passenger lives, saw the fear and uncertainty in their faces, and understood that conventional authority structures had become irrelevant when survival was at stake. Yes, she said simply, I can fly it. The statement carried absolute confidence backed by years of training that had prepared her for exactly this kind of emergency. While Donovan had advanced through programs based on assumptions about his potential, Victoria had spent years mastering the technical knowledge and emergency procedures that were now required to save everyone aboard Flight 447. But I need to understand what we're working with, Victoria continued, moving toward the pilot's position. Mark, I need you to let me assess the actual control authority we have left. Donovan's pride warred with reality for perhaps 3 seconds before survival instincts overrode ego. He released the controls to Victoria, and she immediately felt the aircraft's condition through her hands and feet with the sensitivity that came from thousands of hours of flight experience. The hydraulic failures had created a situation where normal control inputs produced delayed and unpredictable responses. The aircraft wanted to roll left toward the failed engine, required constant pressure to maintain wings level, and was descending despite their attempts to maintain altitude. It was flyable, but only by someone with the experience to compensate for the degraded systems. Kyle, I need you to configure for emergency descent, Victoria commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what needed to happen. We're going to have to get this aircraft on the ground. While we still have some control authority. What about Denver? Brennan asked. We're clear direct, emergency equipment standing by. Victoria's assessment was immediate and definitive. We'll never make Denver with these control problems. I need options for airports within 20 miles, preferably with long runways and good emergency facilities. As Brennan worked his charts and radio to identify closer alternatives, Victoria began flying the aircraft with techniques that demonstrated why her military instructors had rated her as exceptional under pressure. She wasn't fighting the damaged controls, she was working with them, using the remaining hydraulic pressure efficiently, compensating for the asymmetric thrust with rudder inputs that maintained coordinated flight. There's a regional airport 15 miles southwest, Brennan reported. Runway 7,500 feet, emergency equipment available, but it's not a major facility. It'll have to do, Victoria replied, already calculating approach angles and emergency procedures. Mark, I need you to work with the cabin crew. We're going to have to prepare passengers for emergency landing procedures, and there's a good chance we'll have fire suppression equipment spraying the aircraft immediately after touchdown. Donovan nodded, his earlier resistance replaced by recognition that Victoria was demonstrating exactly the kind of capability under pressure that he lacked. The pilot who had been dismissed as unqualified for command decisions was now commanding. the emergency response that would determine whether 108 people lived or died. Denver Center, Western Sky 447. Victoria transmitted, her voice steady and professional. We are diverting to Centennial Airport due to degraded flight controls. Request immediate clearance and emergency equipment. We have 108 souls on board. Fuel for approximately 3 hours, but expect to be on the ground within 20 minutes. The response was immediate. Western Sky 447. Cleared direct Centennial Airport. Descend and maintain at pilot's discretion. Emergency equipment is being notified. Good luck. As Victoria began the approach that would test everything she'd learned about flying under impossible conditions, she realized that every hour of training, every manual she'd memorized, every simulation she'd completed had been preparation for this moment, when theoretical knowledge would become life-or-death reality. The aircraft that had rejected her as unqualified was now depending entirely on her qualifications to survive. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Victoria's hands moved across the instrument panel with the precision of a surgeon, her years of training translating into instinctive responses to the aircraft's degraded condition. Within seconds of taking control, she had stabilized their descent rate and corrected the asymmetric flight condition that had been overwhelming Donovan's attempts to maintain control. Kyle, I need you to run the emergency descent checklist, Victoria commanded, her voice cutting through the cockpit. Noise with absolute authority. Configure the aircraft for approach to Centennial. Mark, coordinate with Rachel on passenger preparation. We're going to have one chance to get this right. The transformation in cockpit dynamics was immediate and profound. Where moments earlier there had been panic and confusion, Victoria's presence created an environment of systematic emergency management that gave everyone specific tasks within their capabilities. Brennan responded to Victoria's commands with the relief of someone who had been drowning and suddenly found solid ground. Emergency descent checklist, Roger. Configuring for approach. Requesting approach charts for Centennial Airport. Victoria's flying technique demonstrated why her military instructors had rated her as exceptional under pressure. Instead of fighting the aircraft's damaged systems, she was working within their limitations, using the remaining hydraulic pressure efficiently, compensating for control delays with precise timing, and maintaining coordinated flight despite the asymmetric thrust. Condition. Western Sky 447, Centennial Tower. Came the voice of the airport controller, his tone professional but urgent. We have emergency equipment standing by. Runway 10 right is clear and available, wind 280 at 15 knots. Be advised we have fire and rescue equipment positioned and ready. Centennial Tower, Western Sky 447, Victoria replied, her transmission calm and precise. We have multiple hydraulic failures following catastrophic engine failure. Expect long. Final approach due to degraded control authority. Request foam on the runway as precautionary measure. Through the cockpit windows, Centennial Airport was becoming visible in the distance, a smaller facility than Denver International, but with a runway long enough to accommodate their emergency landing if Victoria could maintain control through the approach phase. In the passenger cabin, Rachel Kim was coordinating emergency preparations with the systematic efficiency that separated professional flight attendants from those who simply served drinks and snacks. Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for an emergency landing at Centennial Airport. Please review the safety information card in your seat pocket and listen carefully to the following instructions. Professor Fields had positioned herself near an emergency exit, her engineering background making her one of the few passengers who truly understood the severity of their situation. The fact that they were still flying in controlled flight rather than spinning toward the ground suggested that whoever was now controlling the aircraft possessed Exceptional skill under pressure. Dr. Watson had organized the passengers around her into an informal medical triage team, identifying individuals with medical training and positioning them to assist with potential injuries during the emergency landing. Her trauma surgery experience had taught her that preparation and organization during emergencies saved more lives than heroic responses after disasters occurred. Victoria began configuring the aircraft for approach while compensating for systems that weren't responding normally to her control inputs. The hydraulic failures meant that every control movement required more force and produced delayed responses, like trying to steer a car with failing power steering while traveling at highway speeds. Gear extension is going to be problematic, Victoria announced to her crew. Kyle, when I call for landing gear, we'll probably need to use the manual extension procedure. The hydraulic pressure may not be sufficient for normal gear operation. Brennan consulted his emergency procedures manual, finding the section that covered manual landing gear extension, a procedure that required precise timing and coordination between pilots. Manual gear extension checklist ready. I'll need about 90 seconds to complete the procedure when you're ready. Victoria's approach to Centennial Airport demonstrated flying skills that exceeded anything Donovan had displayed during normal operations. She was maintaining precise control of an aircraft that wanted to roll left, maintaining approach speed despite engine thrust that was no longer symmetrical, and planning for an emergency landing that would require techniques not covered in standard training programs. 5 miles from runway, beginning final approach configuration, Victoria announced. Kyle, initiate manual gear extension. Mark, final cabin preparation. Everyone needs to be in crash position on my command. The manual gear extension procedure required Brennan to operate backup systems while Victoria maintained aircraft control with degraded hydraulics. The process took nearly 2 minutes of precise coordination, during which Victoria had to compensate for changing aircraft characteristics as the landing gear deployed and created additional drag. Gear down and locked, Brennan reported, his voice showing both relief and continued tension. All 3 gears showing green lights. We're configured for landing. Victoria's final approach to Centennial Airport was a masterclass in emergency flying technique. She was compensating for control delays by anticipating aircraft responses, maintaining approach speed through careful power management on the remaining engine, and planning for a landing that would require precise touchdown and immediate emergency braking. Centennial Tower, Western Sky 447 on final approach, runway 10 right. Emergency equipment standing by. Western Sky 447. Emergency equipment is positioned and ready. You are cleared to land runway 10 right. Good luck. The runway grew larger in their windscreen as Victoria maintained the approach profile with precision that demonstrated years of training under pressure. Every control input was deliberate and calculated. Every adjustment made with consideration for the aircraft's degraded response characteristics. 1 mile final, Victoria announced. All crew members prepare for emergency landing. Passengers in crash position on my command. In the passenger cabin, Rachel Kim's voice carried over the intercom. Passengers, assume crash position now. Heads down, hands over your heads, feet flat on the floor. Remain in position until the aircraft comes to a complete stop. Victoria's hands moved across the controls with the fluidity that came from complete mastery of aircraft systems and emergency procedures. She was no longer the rejected candidate who had been dismissed as unqualified for command decisions. She was demonstrating exactly the kind of capability under pressure that should have been recognized years earlier. 50 feet. Approach speed stable, Brennan called, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Looking good, Victoria. The runway threshold passed beneath them as Victoria executed a landing that would be analyzed by aviation safety experts for years to come. Her touchdown was precise despite the degraded controls. Her speed control perfect despite the asymmetric engine condition. And her emergency braking technique exactly what was required to bring a damaged aircraft to a safe stop. As Flight 447 rolled to a stop on Centennial Airport's runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles with lights flashing and foam spraying, Victoria realized that everything had changed in the span of 23 minutes. The pilot, who had been dismissed as lacking command capability, had just completed one of the most successful emergency landings in commercial aviation history. But more than personal vindication, she had proven that qualification wasn't about institutional approval. It was about preparation, skill, and the courage to perform when lives depended on excellence. The evacuation of Western Sky Flight 447 proceeded with textbook efficiency, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted 23 minutes earlier when the port engine exploded. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft like protective guardians, their red and blue lights cutting through the afternoon haze as firefighters sprayed foam on the damaged engine to prevent any possibility of reignition. Victoria remained at the controls until the last passenger had evacuated, her hands steady on the yoke even though the aircraft was stationary and powered down. Years of military training had ingrained the principle that the pilot in command's responsibility didn't end until every soul aboard was safe, and she wasn't about to abandon that standard now. All passengers and crew evacuated, Rachel Kim reported. From the cabin door, her voice carrying the exhaustion that followed intense stress. Emergency medical teams are checking everyone, but initial reports suggest no serious injuries during the evacuation. Brennan was staring at Victoria with an expression that mixed disbelief with profound gratitude. "I've never seen flying like that," he said quietly. "The way you controlled this aircraft with those system failures, that was impossible flying. Made to look routine." Victoria finally released the controls and began shutting down the remaining systems, according to post-emergency procedures. "It wasn't impossible, Kyle. It was just different from what you've trained for. Emergency flying requires techniques that aren't covered in normal certification programs." But even as she spoke, Victoria was processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In 23 minutes, she had taken command of a catastrophically damaged aircraft, managed multiple system failures that were overwhelming a qualified crew, and executed an emergency landing that saved 108 lives. The pilot, who had been dismissed as unqualified for command decisions, had just demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything in her training records. Outside the aircraft, Federal Aviation Administration investigators were already gathering to begin the process of documenting what would become one of the most analyzed emergency landings in commercial aviation history. The initial reports were creating excitement throughout the aviation safety community. A civilian aircraft with multiple hydraulic failures and asymmetric engine condition had been landed safely through pilot skill rather than luck or accident. Dr. Watson approached Victoria as she exited the aircraft, her medical training allowing her to recognize the physiological aftermath of extreme stress performance. "Your hands aren't even shaking," she observed. "Most people would be experiencing significant adrenaline response after what you just accomplished." "Military training," Victoria replied. "They teach you to process stress during the event rather than after it's over. The adrenaline response gets channeled into performance rather than anxiety." Professor Fields joined them, her engineering background making her one of the few people who truly understood the technical complexity of what Victoria had achieved. "I was monitoring the engine failure from my seat," she said. "The debris damage should have made controlled flight impossible. How did you maintain authority over the aircraft?" Victoria's explanation demonstrated the depth of knowledge that had been dismissed by her military superiors. Hydraulic failures don't eliminate control authority, they change the relationship between pilot inputs and aircraft response. If you understand the backup systems and compensate for the delays, you can maintain controlled flight longer than most pilots realize. Captain Robert Sterling, Western Sky's chief pilot, arrived at Centennial Airport within an hour of the emergency. Landing. His initial purpose had been to conduct the standard post-incident interviews, but what he discovered was a demonstration of piloting skill that exceeded anything in his 30-year career. "Romano," Sterling said as he approached Victoria near the emergency command post, "I need to understand exactly what happened up there. The air traffic control recordings suggest you took command of the aircraft from Captain Donovan. Is that accurate?" "Captain Donovan was overwhelmed by the system failures," Victoria replied diplomatically. "I offered assistance based on my qualifications, and he accepted that assistance when it became clear that additional expertise was needed." Sterling's expression showed growing amazement as he reviewed the preliminary reports from air traffic control, emergency responders, and the FAA investigators who had already begun documenting the incident. "Victoria, you just completed one of the most successful emergency responses in commercial aviation history. The aircraft had multiple hydraulic failures, asymmetric thrust condition, and degraded flight controls, yet you landed it safely with no injuries." But the true measure of Victoria's achievement was becoming clear through the testimony of everyone who had witnessed her performance. Brennan was describing her flying technique to investigators with language typically reserved for textbook examples of emergency management. Rachel Kim was explaining how Victoria's calm leadership had created confidence throughout the aircraft during the crisis. Most significantly, Donovan himself was providing testimony that would reshape his understanding of pilot qualification and capability. "I was trained for single-system emergencies," he told investigators. "What we experienced was cascade failure that exceeded my training and experience." Victoria's ability to manage multiple simultaneous system failures while maintaining aircraft control demonstrated skills that I simply don't possess. The Federal Aviation Administration's preliminary report, filed within hours of the emergency landing, contained language that would become legendary within aviation safety circles. The pilot in command's decision to accept assistance from a qualified passenger resulted in successful management of an emergency that might otherwise have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. The passenger pilot's performance exceeded standard expectations for emergency response under extreme conditions. Director Angela Foster from Western Sky Airlines corporate headquarters was monitoring the situation from Denver, and her initial concern about liability and public relations was rapidly transforming into recognition that the airline had witnessed something extraordinary. The preliminary passenger statements were uniformly positive, describing Victoria's calm professionalism and life-saving competence. "We need to understand how a passenger pilot was more qualified to handle this emergency than our certificated crew," Foster told her staff during an emergency conference call. "And we need to understand why someone with those qualifications isn't flying for us professionally." The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Victoria had been dismissed from military aviation for supposedly lacking the capability for command decisions under pressure. Yet she had just demonstrated exactly those capabilities in a real-world emergency that exceeded the training scenarios used to evaluate pilot qualifications. Local news media had arrived at Centennial Airport within an hour of the emergency landing, and their initial reports were creating national attention for what passengers were already calling miraculous flying and heroic piloting skills. The story was becoming larger than a simple emergency landing. It was becoming an example of how institutional prejudices could blind organizations to exceptional capability. As Victoria completed her interviews with investigators and prepared to leave the airport, she realized that everything had changed in the span of a single flight. The passenger who had been traveling to Portland for a job interview was now the subject of international attention for aviation skills that had never been properly recognized or utilized. But more than personal vindication, the events of Flight 447 had demonstrated something that would reshape how the aviation industry thought about pilot qualification, capability assessment, and the danger of allowing institutional biases to override merit-based evaluation of professional competence. The pilot who had been told she wasn't ready for command decisions had just saved 108 lives through exactly the kind of command decision-making that her critics had claimed she lacked. Within 72 hours of the emergency landing at Centennial Airport, Victoria Romano found herself at the center of an investigation that would reshape how the aviation industry evaluated pilot qualifications and emergency response capabilities. The National Transportation Safety Board had dispatched their most experienced investigators to document what preliminary reports were already calling an exceptional demonstration of airmanship under impossible conditions. Lead investigator David Park had spent 23 years analyzing aviation accidents and incidents, but the Flight 447 emergency presented him with something unprecedented, a catastrophic system failure that had been successfully managed by a pilot who wasn't even supposed to be flying the aircraft. "Ms. Romano," Park said during their formal interview at the NTSB's Denver field office, "I need you to walk me through your decision-making process from the moment of engine failure through touchdown. What we're seeing in the flight data recorder suggests flying techniques that aren't taught in standard commercial aviation training programs." Victoria's response demonstrated the systematic thinking that had characterized her military training. The key was recognizing that standard emergency procedures assume functioning backup systems. When multiple hydraulic circuits failed simultaneously, I had to adapt to an aircraft with degraded control authority that required different techniques. Flight data recorder analysis was revealing the technical sophistication of Victoria's emergency management. Her control inputs showed precise compensation for hydraulic delays, optimal use of remaining system pressure, and approach techniques that maximize their chances of successful landing despite asymmetric thrust and compromised flight controls. The data shows you maintained coordinated flight throughout the emergency, despite losing both primary and backup hydraulic systems. Park continued, "How were you able to control the aircraft when Captain Donovan was reporting loss of control authority?" "Control authority wasn't eliminated, it was changed," Victoria explained. "The hydraulic failures created delays between control inputs and aircraft response. But if you understand those delays and anticipate them, you can maintain controlled flight longer than most pilots realize possible." Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the aviation safety expert reviewing Victoria's performance for the NTSB, was documenting techniques that would be incorporated into future emergency training programs. "Your approach speed management was perfect despite the asymmetric engine condition. That level of precision suggests training that goes beyond standard commercial certification requirements." Military transport training includes scenarios for catastrophic system failures that commercial programs don't typically cover, Victoria replied. "Flying C-130s into combat zones requires preparation for damage that goes beyond simple component failures." The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the investigation. Victoria's military training, the same background that had been dismissed as inadequate for command positions, had provided exactly the skills needed to save Flight 447. Her systematic approach to emergency management, her understanding of complex aircraft systems, and her ability to perform under extreme pressure were precisely the qualifications that should have been recognized rather than dismissed. Meanwhile, a parallel investigation was revealing the institutional failures that had led to Victoria's military dismissal. Colonel Frank Russo's evaluation methods were being scrutinized by Military Aviation Command, and the patterns emerging suggested systematic bias that had prevented qualified candidates from advancing while less capable pilots received preferred assignments. Master Sergeant Kim, now retired from active duty, provided testimony that documented the discrimination Victoria had faced. Romano's technical knowledge exceeded every other candidate in the program, but Colonel Russo consistently found reasons to question her qualifications that he never applied to male candidates with inferior performance records. The military investigation was uncovering evidence that Russo's assessment criteria had been inconsistently applied, with female candidates held to standards that weren't required of their male counterparts. Victoria's rejection from the C-130 program was part of a pattern that had prevented several qualified women from advancing to command positions, but the vindication was extending beyond just Victoria's individual case. The Flight 447 emergency was forcing both military and civilian aviation authorities to examine how they evaluated pilot qualifications, particularly the tendency to prioritize traditional experience over demonstrated competence and systematic preparation. Captain Sterling from Western Sky Airlines was conducting his own review of company hiring practices, and his findings were disturbing. We've been overlooking qualified candidates because they didn't fit conventional profiles, while hiring pilots who met traditional criteria but lacked the depth of knowledge that exceptional emergency management requires. The preliminary NTSB report, released 1 week after the incident, contained findings that would become landmark statements in aviation safety literature. The successful outcome of this emergency demonstrates that pilot qualification cannot be adequately assessed through conventional metrics alone. The passenger pilot's performance exceeded the capabilities demonstrated by the certificated crew, suggesting systematic deficiencies in current evaluation methodologies. Dr. Watson, who had witnessed Victoria's performance from the passenger cabin, provided testimony that captured the broader implications. What I observed wasn't just technical competence, it was leadership under pressure that transformed a potentially catastrophic situation into a manageable emergency through systematic decision-making and clear communication. Professor Field's engineering analysis of the aircraft damage confirmed that Victoria had achieved something that should have been impossible. The extent of hydraulic system damage made normal flight control extremely difficult. Maintaining controlled flight to successful landing required understanding of aircraft systems that goes far beyond standard pilot training. The media attention surrounding Flight 447 was creating national discussion about institutional bias in professional advancement. Victoria's story was being cited as an example of how organizational prejudices could blind institutions to exceptional capability, potentially costing lives when that capability was needed most. Director Foster from Western Sky Airlines was facing pressure from multiple sources to address the disparity between Victoria's obvious qualifications and her previous lack of opportunities in commercial aviation. We've identified a pilot whose emergency management skills exceed anything in our current crew complement, yet she was interviewing for entry-level positions because institutional biases had prevented her advancement. The investigation was also revealing the broader costs of institutional discrimination. Victoria's military dismissal had removed from service a pilot whose capabilities might have prevented other aviation incidents if she had been given appropriate command opportunities. The system designed to identify and develop exceptional pilots had instead pushed exceptional capability into civilian roles where it remained unrecognized until emergency circumstances revealed its true value. As the formal investigation continued, Victoria found herself receiving job offers from major airlines, military contractor positions, and aviation safety organizations that recognized her demonstrated capabilities. The pilot who had been dismissed as unqualified was now being recruited by organizations that understood the difference between conventional qualifications and exceptional competence. But perhaps the most significant vindication came from an unexpected source, Captain Donovan himself, who provided testimony that would define his own character while acknowledging Victoria's superior qualifications. "I was selected for military programs that she was denied," Donovan testified. but her performance during this emergency demonstrated capabilities that I simply don't possess. The system that chose me over her was fundamentally flawed in its assessment of who was truly qualified for command responsibilities. The investigation was proving that Victoria's dismissal from military aviation had been one of the most costly personnel decisions in recent Air Force history, removing from service a pilot whose capabilities exceeded those of the candidates who were selected instead. 6 months after Flight 447's emergency landing, the aviation industry was implementing changes that would reshape how pilot qualifications were assessed for generations to come. Victoria Romano stood in the conference room at the Federal Aviation Administration's headquarters in Washington, D.C., reviewing training protocols that bore her name and reflected lessons learned from her extraordinary emergency management. The Romano Emergency Response Protocols, as they were officially designated, represented a fundamental shift from traditional training that emphasized following checklists to dynamic problem-solving that prioritized understanding aircraft systems well enough to adapt when standard procedures proved inadequate. Your performance during Flight 447 demonstrated that exceptional emergency management requires deeper technical knowledge than we've traditionally required, explained Administrator Sarah Chun, the FAA's Director of Pilot Certification. We're restructuring our training requirements to identify and develop the kind of systematic thinking you displayed under pressure. Victoria had been appointed as the FAA's Senior Advisor for Emergency Response Training, a newly created position that recognized her unique qualifications for developing programs that would prevent future tragedies. The job offered her the opportunity to influence aviation safety on a national scale while ensuring that institutional biases wouldn't prevent other qualified candidates from advancing to positions where their capabilities could save lives. The changes extended far beyond training protocols. Airlines throughout the country were revising their hiring practices to identify candidates with the depth of technical knowledge and emergency management skills that Victoria had demonstrated. The emphasis was shifting from conventional experience metrics to demonstrated competence under pressure. Western Sky Airlines had offered Victoria their chief pilot position, recognizing that her emergency management capabilities exceeded anything in their current leadership structure. Captain Sterling's recommendation had been unequivocal. Romano's performance during the Flight 447 emergency represents the gold standard for pilot capability under pressure. She should be training other pilots, not looking for entry-level positions. But perhaps the most significant transformation was occurring within military aviation. Colonel Russo had been relieved of command and was facing court-martial proceedings for systematic discrimination that had damaged the Air Force's ability to identify and develop exceptional pilots. His replacement, Colonel Janet Brooks, had specifically requested Victoria's consultation in developing new evaluation methods that would prevent qualified candidates from being dismissed due to institutional prejudices. Your case has become legendary within military aviation circles, Brooks explained during their initial meeting at the Pentagon. Not just because of your technical performance, but because it demonstrated how institutional biases can blind us to exceptional capability when we need it most. The military was implementing the Romano Standards evaluation criteria that emphasized demonstrated competence over traditional metrics, systematic thinking over conventional experience, and performance under pressure over subjective assessments of leadership potential. Victoria's emergency management techniques were being incorporated into training programs throughout the Air Force, Navy, and Army aviation commands. Lieutenant Alex Reeves, who had supported Victoria during her difficult period at Whitman Air Force Base, was now part of the team implementing these new standards. Your vindication has changed everything, he told Victoria during a visit to the FAA headquarters. The pilots who dismissed your qualifications are now studying your techniques as examples of exceptional emergency management. The broader implications were extending beyond aviation. Victoria's story had become a case study in business schools, leadership development programs, and diversity training initiatives throughout corporate America. The Flight 447 emergency was being cited as evidence of how institutional prejudices could prevent organizations from recognizing and utilizing exceptional talent. Dr. Watson, who had witnessed Victoria's performance from the passenger cabin, was using the incident in her medical training programs. The systematic decision-making and calm leadership Romano displayed under extreme pressure represents exactly the kind of capability we need to develop in emergency medical situations. Professor Fields had incorporated the technical aspects of Victoria's emergency management into her engineering curriculum, using the Flight 447 case to demonstrate how theoretical knowledge becomes practical capability when applied by someone who truly understands complex systems. But the transformation that meant the most to Victoria was personal. She was no longer the dismissed candidate who had been told she wasn't qualified for command responsibilities. She was recognized as one of the most capable emergency pilots in commercial aviation history, with qualifications that were being used to train other pilots and develop safety standards that would protect travelers for decades to come. The job offers had been overwhelming. Major airlines wanted her as chief pilot. Aircraft manufacturers wanted her expertise in developing training programs, and military contractors wanted her knowledge for developing emergency response procedures. But Victoria had chosen the FAA position because it offered the greatest opportunity to prevent other qualified candidates from experiencing the discrimination she had faced. The real victory isn't personal vindication, Victoria explained during a speech at the National Aviation Safety Conference. It's knowing that the changes we're implementing will ensure that capability is recognized, regardless of who demonstrates it or whether it fits conventional expectations. The conference audience airline executives, military commanders, FAA officials, and pilot training instructors gave her a standing ovation that lasted 3 minutes. These were the same professional communities that had dismissed her qualifications 18 months earlier, now recognizing her as a leading authority on aviation safety and emergency management. Kyle Brennan, the co-pilot who had asked, "Can you fly?" during the Flight 447 emergency, was now working with Victoria on developing new training protocols. "I learned more about flying during those 23 minutes with you than I had in 2 years of commercial aviation," he told her. "You didn't just save our lives, you changed how I think about what it means to be a pilot." Mark Donovan had left commercial aviation to pursue a career in aircraft maintenance, recognizing that his strengths lay in technical support rather than flight operations. His honest testimony about Victoria's superior qualifications had helped expose the institutional failures that had prevented her advancement, and his acknowledgement of her capabilities had demonstrated personal integrity that partially redeemed his earlier advantages. "I spent years thinking I was qualified for positions that should have gone to more capable candidates," Donovan had admitted during the investigation. "Victoria's performance proved that the system that selected me over her was fundamentally broken." The Romano Training Institute, established with FS funding and Victoria's oversight, was developing the next generation of pilots according to standards that prioritized competence over conventional criteria. The program was producing pilots whose emergency management skills reflected the systematic thinking and technical mastery that Victoria had demonstrated during Flight 447. As Victoria reviewed the latest training statistics from institutes implementing her protocols, she realized that the transformation was working. Pilot candidates who might have been overlooked by traditional programs were demonstrating exceptional capabilities when evaluated according to criteria that measured actual competence rather than conformity to institutional expectations. Universe had indeed created a moment when performance mattered more than politics, when capability trumped prejudice, and when the pilot everyone had dismissed as unqualified proved that qualification was about preparation, knowledge, and courage. rather than institutional approval or traditional metrics. 1 year after the Flight 447 emergency, Victoria Romano received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during her military service. The United States Air Force Academy wanted her to deliver the keynote address at their graduation ceremony, speaking to the next generation of military pilots about leadership, capability, and the importance of institutional integrity in recognizing exceptional talent. Standing at the podium in the Academy's Falcon Stadium, looking out at 800 newly commissioned officers who would shape the future of American military aviation, Victoria felt the weight of responsibility that came with representing change rather than simply experiencing it. 18 months ago, I was told that I wasn't qualified for command responsibilities. Victoria began, her voice carrying across the stadium with the confidence that came from proven capability rather than institutional approval. Today, the techniques I was dismissed for not possessing are being used to train pilots throughout the Air Force, Navy, and commercial aviation. The audience, cadets, faculty, military leadership, and families listened with the attention that exceptional speakers command. Victoria's story had become legendary within military circles, not just for her technical performance during the emergency, but for what it revealed about institutional failures that had cost the military some of its most capable pilots. The lesson isn't about my individual vindication, Victoria continued. It's about the danger of allowing institutional prejudices to override merit-based evaluation. When we dismiss capability because it doesn't conform to our expectations, we don't just harm individual careers, we compromise our ability to accomplish the missions that serve our nation. In the audience, General Patricia Hammond, now the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, was taking notes for the comprehensive reform program she was implementing throughout military aviation. Victoria's case had become the catalyst for examining every aspect of how the Air Force identified, developed, and advanced exceptional talent. The Romano reforms, as they were being called throughout the Pentagon, represented the most comprehensive change in military pilot evaluation since the integration of women into combat roles. The emphasis was shifting from subjective assessments of leadership potential to objective measurement of technical competence, emergency management capability, and performance under pressure. Colonel Janet Brooks, who had replaced Russo as commander of the C-130 program, was documenting results that vindicated Victoria's approach to pilot development. The candidates were advancing under the new criteria, are demonstrating capabilities that exceed anything we achieved under previous evaluation methods. Brooks reported to Air Force leadership, the new standards were producing pilots whose technical knowledge and emergency management skills reflected the systematic thinking that Victoria had displayed during Flight 447. More importantly, they were preventing qualified candidates from being dismissed due to biases that had nothing to do with their actual capabilities. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of the first female pilots to advance through the reformed C-130 program, had specifically requested assignment to Victoria's former position at Whitman Air Force Base. "I'm flying missions that Romano should have been flying 2 years ago," Martinez told reporters. "But because of the changes her case inspired, pilots like me now have opportunities that merit rather than politics determines." The transformations extended beyond military aviation into every aspect of American aerospace. NASA had revised their astronaut selection criteria to emphasize the kind of systematic problem-solving and emergency management skills that Victoria had demonstrated. The space agency recognized that future missions would require crew members capable of managing unprecedented challenges with limited support from ground control. Commercial airlines were reporting improved safety statistics as the Romano protocols became standard throughout the industry. Pilots trained according to Victoria's methods were demonstrating better emergency response times, more effective crew resource management, and superior decision-making under pressure. Captain Jennifer Walsh, now Western Sky Airlines Vice President of Flight Operations, was overseeing implementation of training programs that reflected lessons learned from Flight 447. Romano's techniques aren't just about emergency management, Walsh explained to industry leaders. They're about developing pilots who understand aircraft systems well enough to solve problems that aren't covered in standard procedures. The Romano Training Institute had expanded to include partnerships with major airlines, aircraft manufacturers, and international aviation authorities. Pilots from around the world were studying Victoria's emergency management techniques, and her systematic approach to aviation safety was being translated into multiple languages for global implementation. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the next generation of aviators. Flight schools throughout the country were reporting increased applications from candidates who had been inspired by Victoria's story to pursue aviation careers. Her demonstration that exceptional capability would eventually be recognized was encouraging qualified individuals who might otherwise have been deterred by institutional barriers. Emily Foster, a 22-year-old mechanical engineering graduate who had applied for Air Force pilot training, represented this new generation. Romano's story proved that if you're truly qualified and prepared to excel, the system will eventually recognize your capabilities. That gives me confidence that my gender won't prevent me from advancing based on merit. The Federal Aviation Administration was documenting measurable improvements in aviation safety statistics that correlated with implementation of the Romano protocols. Emergency response times were improving, crew resource management was more effective, and incidents that might previously have resulted in accidents were being successfully managed by pilots whose training reflected Victoria's systematic approach. Dr. Michael Chun, the FAA's Director of Aviation Safety Research, was presenting findings that validated Victoria's influence on industry-wide safety improvements. The techniques developed from analysis of Romano's Flight 447 performance are producing measurable improvements in pilot capability under pressure. We're seeing fewer incidents escalate to accidents because pilots are better prepared to manage complex emergencies. The international aviation community was implementing similar reforms. The European Aviation Safety Agency had adopted modified versions of the Romano standards, and pilot training programs throughout Asia and Australia were incorporating her emergency management techniques. Victoria's influence was extending beyond aviation into other high-pressure professions. Medical schools were studying her systematic approach to emergency decision-making, incorporating her techniques into surgical training programs. Business schools were using her case as an example of how organizations could identify and develop exceptional talent while avoiding institutional biases that prevented advancement based on merit. The Romano Institute for Leadership Excellence, established at the Air Force Academy, was developing future military officers according to principles that emphasized capability assessment over conventional criteria. The program was producing graduates whose leadership potential was measured by demonstrated competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. As Victoria concluded her Academy address, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred since that Tuesday morning when Colonel Russo had dismissed her qualifications. Your generation has the opportunity to lead organizations that recognize exceptional capability regardless of its source. The question isn't whether you possess the qualifications for leadership. It's whether you'll have the integrity to recognize and develop those qualifications in others. The standing ovation lasted 7 minutes, but more importantly, the principles Victoria represented were being carried forward by officers who would reshape military aviation for decades to come. The pilot who had been dismissed as unqualified had become the standard by which qualification itself was measured. 2 years after Western Sky Flight 447's emergency landing, Victoria Romano stood on the observation deck at Denver International Airport, watching aircraft take off and land with the routine precision that made commercial aviation the safest form of transportation in human history. But her perspective had changed fundamentally since that afternoon when she'd been just a passenger, enjoying the view at 35,000 feet. The airport below was implementing safety protocols that bore her name, training pilots according to methods she had developed, and using emergency response procedures that reflected lessons learned from her extraordinary demonstration of capability under pressure. Every aircraft departure represented lives that were safer because institutional changes had prioritized competence over conventional criteria. "The final NTSB report is being released today," said Kyle Brennan, approaching from the elevator that served the airport's administrative offices. Brennan was now the Director of Emergency Response Training for the FAS Western Region, a position that utilized his first-hand experience with Victoria's life-saving techniques. Victoria nodded, though she'd already reviewed the report's conclusions during her briefing that morning. The official findings would become part of aviation history, the successful outcome of Western Sky Flight 447 demonstrated that exceptional emergency management requires systematic preparation, comprehensive technical knowledge, and the ability to adapt standard procedures to unprecedented circumstances. The passenger pilot's performance exceeded conventional expectations and established new benchmarks for capability assessment throughout the aviation industry. But the report's technical language couldn't capture the human transformation that had occurred since that March afternoon when Flight 447's engine exploded. Victoria was no longer fighting for recognition of her capabilities. She was using those capabilities to ensure that other qualified individuals wouldn't face the institutional barriers that had nearly prevented her talents from being utilized when they were needed most. The Romano Center for Aviation Excellence, established on the campus of the Colorado Aerospace University, had become the premier training facility for pilots whose capabilities exceeded conventional standards. The center was producing aviators whose emergency management skills, technical knowledge, and systematic thinking reflected the principles Victoria had demonstrated during the Flight 447 crisis. "We've got 847 pilots who've completed the Advanced Emergency Management Program," Brennan reported, reviewing statistics that validated Victoria's influence on aviation safety. "Their performance during subsequent emergencies has been 73% more effective than pilots trained under previous methods. You've literally saved thousands of lives through the ripple effects of your training programs." Victoria smiled, remembering the conversation with Master Sergeant Kim 2 years earlier, when Kim had predicted that the universe would create moments when performance mattered more than politics. The prediction had been accurate, but the moment had generated consequences that extended far beyond Victoria's individual vindication. Dr. Emily Watson, now serving on the Romano Center's Medical Advisory Board, joined them on the observation deck. Her trauma surgery experience had been invaluable in developing training programs that prepared pilots for medical emergencies at altitude, scenarios where Victoria's systematic decision-making approach proved equally effective. "The medical charter company in Portland finally got their interview with you," Watson said with amusement. "Though I suspect they're more interested in having you develop their training programs than fly their aircraft." The job interview Victoria had been traveling to when Flight 447's engine exploded had evolved into something far more significant. The charter company now operated under Romano Medical Aviation, providing emergency medical transport services that utilized the most advanced emergency management techniques in commercial aviation. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was occurring within the military aviation community that had initially dismissed Victoria's qualifications. The Air Force Academy's latest graduating class included the highest percentage of female pilots in history, with many citing Victoria's story as inspiration for pursuing military aviation careers despite traditional barriers. Colonel Janet Brooks, who had implemented the Romano standards throughout the C-130 program, was documenting results that vindicated merit-based advancement. We're producing pilots whose capabilities exceed anything achieved under previous selection. Criteria. The systematic approach Romano advocated is generating exceptional performance throughout our training programs. The contrast with Colonel Russo's failures was stark and intentional. Russo's court-martial had resulted in dismissal from service and criminal charges for systematic discrimination that had damaged military readiness. His replacement represented a new generation of military leadership that prioritized institutional integrity over personal prejudices. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, now a C-130 aircraft commander at Whitman Air Force Base, was flying missions that Victoria should have been conducting 2 years earlier. But Martinez's success validated the institutional changes that Victoria's case had inspired, proving that qualified candidates would advance when evaluation systems measured actual capability rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Romano's vindication changed everything for female pilots in military aviation. Martinez explained during a recent interview, "Not because it proved we could fly, we always knew that, but because it forced the system to acknowledge that dismissing qualified candidates based on prejudice compromises mission effectiveness." Victoria's influence was extending beyond aviation into other professions, where capability assessment had been distorted by institutional biases. Medical schools, engineering programs, and corporate leadership development initiatives were implementing Romano principles that emphasized demonstrated competence over conventional credentials. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had consulted Victoria on developing selection criteria for their aviation unit, recognizing that her systematic approach to identifying exceptional capability could improve their ability to recruit pilots for specialized law enforcement missions. International aviation authorities were implementing modified versions of Victoria's training protocols, with pilots from over 30 countries studying her emergency management techniques. The Flight 447 case had become a global standard for aviation safety education, with Victoria's decision-making process analyzed in flight schools throughout Europe, Asia, and Australia. As the sun set over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades that reminded Victoria of that afternoon when she'd been enjoying the view from seat 12A, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from dismissed candidate to industry standard. The passenger who had been traveling to Portland for an entry-level job interview was now the architect of aviation safety programs that would protect travelers for generations. The pilot who had been told she wasn't qualified for command decisions was now training the commanders who would lead military aviation into the future. But the most significant victory wasn't personal recognition or career advancement. It was knowing that institutional changes inspired by her case would prevent other qualified individuals from experiencing the discrimination she had faced. The system that had dismissed exceptional capability because it didn't conform to expectations was being replaced by standards that measured actual competence rather than conventional credentials. "The universe did create the right moment," Victoria said quietly, remembering Kim's prediction from 2 years earlier. "But the real achievement is using that moment to build something better for everyone who comes after." As aircraft continued their precise ballet of departures and arrivals below, Victoria understood that her story had become part of aviation history, not because she had saved 108 lives during an emergency, but because she had proven that exceptional capability would eventually be recognized when institutions had the integrity to prioritize merit over prejudice. The pilot who had been dismissed as unqualified had become the standard by which qualification itself was measured, ensuring that future aviators would be evaluated based on what they could accomplish rather than assumptions about what they couldn't achieve. Sometimes the most important victories were the ones that opened doors for others to walk through. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.